I hope this is an interesting video. I just want to talk about knots before I release this whole series. Why I got into knots, when I was young in the Scouts and I learned some knots, I didn't retain them. They weren't that interesting to me. I just didn't understand the value, importance, and the fun of being able to tie knots. And when my wife and I first got married, we lived in her grandparents' basement. So good old Al, we'll just call him Al, he was an old-timer, obviously, grandparents, right? And I remember we were taking a load somewhere in the back of his pickup truck, and he had to tie something down. And I couldn't tell you what the knot that he used, but he uses that rope and he just ties this knot, and it looked so cool that he did it so fast without even thinking. And I thought, you know what? That is the coolest thing, and I have no idea how to do that. So I told myself, you know what? I'm going to learn how to tie knots. And a little bit later, my wife and I, with my brother Sleeves and her sister, actually went to California, to Escondido, California, on a vacation. Went down there to house sit for someone, actually. I'll have to roll in some footage at some point, or make a random ramblings if I can find it. Some old footage of me and my brother. They had kids, and we dressed up in this battle gear, this plastic kid battle gear, and had a lightsaber fight. It's hilarious. Anyways, if I can find that, I'll dig it out. But while we were there, I got on the internet and started researching knots and started to learn how to tie knots. And that was, geez, 11 years ago. And I'm not a knot expert. I don't know how to tie 1,000 knots. I have a very kind of core group of knots that I use. And I think that's valuable because it just helps you retain them, especially when you're using that core group. So you're using the same knots over and over again. And to be honest, in some cases, there's probably a better knot to be used for what I'm trying to do. But again, I don't want to know 100 knots for every situation, because I'll be honest, I'm not going to retain that information. So sometimes I think people find knots to be a little difficult, but think about tying your shoes every day. You do that without thought. That's a knot. That's a knot. So the trick is, I think, is just repetition. And a lot of you guys that maybe think, I don't get outdoors because there's nowhere to get outdoors where I live, is you can use knots around the house, or you can practice around the house. So a lot of things that I do sometimes if I can't get out like this is I use the kitchen table legs, to mock up a ridge line and to practice those knots or to learn new knots. I've also used them. We had this entertainment center at home, and Trout, he's over here listening. He's kind of being quiet, huh, bud? But Trout and Hawk used to get into this entertainment center when they were little kids, and we didn't want them to get in there. He's staring at me because we had electronics in there. So what I did is I took a rope. So what it has these two doors that swung open like this. Then it had some middle shelves, and the two doors had knobs on them. So I just tied some knots. Actually, the one of them I used was a taut line hitch. Now, it's not going to keep out a teenager, right? But it'll keep out little kids. I used that taut line hitch on one side. I think I used a figure 8 on the other. And then what they did when they tried to open those is the rope caught in between and wouldn't allow them to open. My point is knots aren't just useful out here in the wilderness, but it's also useful at home for many things. If you got to take a load to the dump. Where I live, the landfills, it's the law that you cover your landfill with a tarp, or your garbage, whatever you're bringing in your truck, with a tarp, or they'll charge you $10 extra. So you've got to tie that down, and knowing knots and how to do that is very helpful. I've used knots moving. I tell you, I've moved so many times I don't even want to think about moving anymore. But in each of those moves, you use knots to help secure certain things so they're not tipping over as you drive on. One thing I do to help practice with my knots, my knot tying, is I keep a short piece of cordage around the house. And if I'm bored or I'm watching a movie or something like that, I can pick it up and just, try practicing a little bit. I feel that helps me personally retain that information. Because sometimes I'll get out here and I haven't been out for a little bit, and I'll go to tie a knot. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, how did that go? And it takes me a minute to think about it. So if I keep that cordage around the house, that tends to help me. Also, in tying these knots when I release these videos, watch the comments, and guys will probably jump in and say, oh, you know what, a better way to tie this, or another knot that might be useful. And read that stuff, because you might find a knot that for whatever reasons sticks in your brain a little bit better than what I'm showing you. But the knots I am going to show you, they're pretty easy knots. They're not dressy knots. I love dressy knots, but they're not very practical, and so I don't use them a lot. There is one that I use that is practical, and honestly I don't use it enough that each time I go to tie it I usually have to remind myself, and it takes a while to remember. But that's, I don't know, it's kind of a knot discussion. I hope that's interesting. I'm going to release a bunch of these videos. I've already shot, I think, 3 knot videos, and I'll be releasing them after this one, but I'll be adding more as time goes, and I'll just make this its own little series, and hopefully it'll be very useful to you guys. I find these knots to be very useful to me, so I'll try and do what I can to pass that along to you guys. All right, thanks. Trout, you have anything to say?
No.
Nope. Oh, he's over there tying knots.